Welcome to the Talent Optimization Podcast, the go-to podcast for CEOs and HR professionals wanting to bridge the gap between the strategy and tactical implementation of talent optimization within their organizations. Through interviews, predictive index, and personal experience, your host, Tracy Shirk, helps you discover the facets of talent optimization from both a CEO and HR perspective to truly create the dream team for your organization. Are you ready? Let's get started.
Welcome to the Talent Optimization Podcast. My name is Tracy Austin, and I'm the Chief Talent Officer here at Elevated Talent Consulting. And we are thrilled that you are with us. And if you're with us every single week, thank you so much for listening in again this week. And if you're brand new to us or you're a frequent listener, but you haven't yet subscribed, please click on that little plus button, subscribe, and make sure you give us all of the stars because we like all of them. So with that, we thank you so much for being with us. And today we are chatting about pressure. Like there was no pressure with those stars at all, was there? So with that being said, we're in a let's go back to school kind of a mindset. And if you have littles or, grandkids or anything like that, we know that getting ready for the end of August, beginning of September has some pressure with it, but it's also exciting. It's like, yay, we get back in our schedule and we get ready to close out this amazing year. So with that being said, we have an amazing guest on with us today of Jolie Wills with Hummingly. So welcome to our podcast.
Thanks, Tracy. Thanks very much for having me.
Yeah. So I'm curious, why does pressure matter to you?
Great question. So our careers have quite literally been a series of disasters, right? So talking about my co-founder and myself, and we mean that in a literal sense. And we're talking about large scale disasters, huge tsunamis, massive earthquakes. So, working in that kind of environment, there is plenty of pressure, right? You just cannot afford not to be doing the right things for communities, cannot afford not to sustain your people. And, there's so much pressure in that kind of environment, which has been an amazing learning environment for understanding how pressure works, what it is we need to do to set up leaders to be able to perform under pressure, but also to equip their teams to do well under pressure. So pressure proofing in a sense. And the other thing is I'm a cognitive scientist, and that means I'm really interested in the connection between stress and performance. So how pressure impacts the way that we can absorb information, make decisions, do our jobs, essentially, do well in our life and at work.
So I'm really curious, how does pressure and stress impact performance?
Yeah, so we give you just a little bit of cognitive science, right? We call this the N graph. So if you imagine a hill, so there's something that we can do in the laboratory, right? As cognitive scientists, this isn't something I've ever run in terms of an experiment with people myself. I've just been my own social experiment working after disaster, in a sense. But this is what happens. Essentially, we can artificially alter your cortisol levels in your bloodstream. So this is one of your stress hormones. And then we can test you, Tracy, with a whole lot of, cognitive tests. How well do you absorb information, remember things? What is your problem solving capabilities like at different levels of stress? So we can change your stress hormones and then see how you do on these cognitive performance tests. And what we find is when your stress levels are very low, the cortisol in your bloodstream is low, we actually perform really poorly. So that's the bottom left-hand side of the hill. And it means that actually we don't do very well with remembering things or problem solving or thinking creatively. And that's kind of counterintuitive because we're always taught that stress is bad. But if you don't have enough pressure, when it comes to a particular application in life, if there's something, a task or a challenge, if there's not enough at stake, if we don't care enough about something, if we don't have enough skin in the game, there is plenty of other things that are going to grab our attention and our energy. And so, without very much stress or pressure at all in an area, we won't perform particularly well. But if you then increase that cortisol and get this moderate amount of pressure, we perform beautifully, right? We hit things out of the park. We step up and do things that we didn't even think that we could do. And then the flip side is if pressure goes on for too long or becomes too much, our performance crashes. right? It's at this point that we can't sort the simplest of things. We're running around looking for our glasses when they're on our heads, like we're making poor decisions, all of those things that if you're a human, this is a very real phenomenon.
So deadlines, especially for us procrastinators that know like, hey, I can't do it 2 weeks before, even a week before, even 3 days before. But if I know the deadline's there and it's at midnight, man, that day I am so productive.
That's the, ultimate example of optimal pressure, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Because you know that once that deadline passes, it's done.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And that is part of that, having the right amount of stress for the right amount of time to help performance. But the challenges in the kind of world that we're operating in now, especially since COVID and all the other pressures and change and things that we're facing in our world, whether it's things that are going on at home, things that are going on at work, very changed ways of operating, pressure, uncertainty, change at a fast pace. These are all kind of features of our world right now. And so we see a lot of leaders and teams and people really grappling with how do we set ourselves up to perform under pressure without burning ourselves or others out. And that is a real sweet spot that we've had to learn to navigate in the world after disaster and leading teams in really pressured environments.
So when we look at, as leaders inside of organizations, and as most of our listeners are either small business owners or HR leaders, there's a responsibility of building, your organization so that there's the right amount of pressures, but also there's, you've got the cyclical nature of business and of organizations that there's times where it's on and times that it's not. So what is that responsibility?
Yeah, so I think, leaders in organizations who know how to equip their people to do pressure well, and pressure provides the most amazing conditions for personal and professional growth if we have the right supports in place, right? But if it goes on for too long or is too much, or we don't manage it well in an organization or as leaders, it is incredibly harmful. So it's like a hazard, right? But the flip side of managing that hazard to prevent harm is really positive. It's not just preventing harm, it's promoting growth, which can be this amazing competitive advantage. So, a huge amount of responsibility as leaders in organizations, because it's going to be key to success of an organization, key to doing anything big and meaningful, but also key to developing your people well, so a huge responsibility. Tracy, can I tell a little bit of a backstory? Is that helpful?
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to hear the backstory. Then I'd also love to hear like an example in your work of where this has been done really well, and maybe where you stepped in to say, okay, that wasn't going well, and here's how we right-sized it.
Right. So one of the big disasters, it's actually happened in my home city of Christchurch in New Zealand. We had this huge earthquake. And when I say huge, like we had in a population of 400,000, 95% of the homes were damaged or destroyed. We lost the lives of 185 people. Thousands were injured. Our central business district was roped off for 2 or 3 years in terms of the really complicated rebuild process. And all of our horizontal infrastructure, our pipes, roads, broken and needed. There's a 5-year repair program just there. So essentially you had a population who were impacted by this massive disruptive event with a whole lot of grief and disruption, much like we saw in COVID, but also with a really long recovery tail, as we saw with COVID, and everything that's happened since. So we had 15,000 aftershocks over the period of 5 years. So that constant sense of being under threat or uncertainty and constantly having to really innovate how you do things, how you work together, how your team connects, how you parent. So all of the things that we've actually seen play out over the last couple of years. And so it was in that environment we were leading a team of people under immense pressure with a really vital role to play. So a really big challenge ahead of them that we just couldn't afford for them to fail. And they were mission-led and motivated and wanted to do well. But the reality was, as a cognitive scientist, I knew they were going to be under pressure for a really long period of time. So we needed to be intentional about setting them up to perform under pressure without burning them out. And so my learning there was, okay, we're going to throw everything we could possibly think of in terms of well-being strategies at this team. And the reality was we still were burning them out. We were just burning them out slower than everyone else around us because we were intentional about it, about trying to prevent it. But the reality was none of us were heading to a good place. And the learning for me was, it is very normal, the approach that we would normally take, and I'm still seeing being applied, in organizations everywhere is, we're thinking very much around, we were trying to be proactive, but a lot of the time you see the reactive, let's make sure there's counselling or remedial processes in place, when people are showing symptoms or challenges to their mental health and their well-being, whereas you really need to be proactive like we would in any other hazard. If this is harmful and hazardous, how do we really help to keep people safe rather than really putting all our energy on helping to heal someone once we've injured them. And then the other piece was we often see a whole lot of physical focus in people's well-being and strategies and approaches. So, it's much easier to think about, gym memberships or monitoring, cardio, all those things that are important, but are only one dimension that we need to focus on. And then we see a whole lot focused on individual self-care, which really neglects some of the other pieces that are really important. So for example, working in this kind of environment, it's like carrying a load of bricks that just keep the cumulative stress and the prolonged pressure, those bricks just keep getting heavier. And it's like saying, Tracy, I can see you're carrying this massive load. It's really important you look after yourself, right? Self-care is really important. And that's true. But then in the next minute, your manager coming and saying there's 5 more urgent things that need to be done by the end of the week and chucking 5 bricks on. So for us, that self-care piece is really important, but focusing on that alone, which most organizations do, is not going to work, and likewise, a lot of the wellbeing solutions and approaches we were trying just weren't designed for the pressured environment that we kind of operate now in today's world. They often felt impossible to implement and do for people under pressure. Like we all know we should eat 5 fruit and veggies a day, right? We all know sleep's important, but the bridge between knowing it and doing it is the hard bit. And so for us, it was creating all of those pieces to help an organization think about it more holistically in a systemic way. What do leaders need to know? How do we equip teams to be cohesive and to support each other? What's the PPE in a sense? What are the tools we give individuals? And all pressure tested, designed to work under pressure. That I think is a really important focus.
Yeah. So when you look at all the measures that you put in place, and as you're looking at what those hazards are, I guess, what are some of those things that you do put in place to ensure that, hey, we're not just saying, go take care of yourself, but here's more to do?
Yeah. So we often say it's like asking your team to climb Grit Mountain. Right. If you're achieving anything big or meaningful, there's usually a sustained kind of approach to it. It's a sustained pressure. It's a long-term, long-haul kind of challenge that you're asking your people to step up to. And what you tend to see is, we get excited about the vision, everyone pulls together, we set off at this cracking pace. And then over time, when we're really sustaining our approach towards the top of that mountain, there's a point on that journey where, that prolonged pressure takes a bit of a toll, and that we get really tired, we get fatigued. There's a point at which it's often hard to keep your eyes focused on the end goal, on that peak. It is really hard for a team when they're all tired to work really constructively together, and it's really hard to keep a sense of perspective. It's like the clouds roll in. So for leaders, it's understanding that journey to get to the top of that grit mountain. There's a point at which your team will enter that grit zone, and it's understanding the sort of strategies that you can put in place to really proactively keep your team connected, keep them supporting each other, keep them communicating well, really understand the importance of strategic rest and managing energy for your team along the way. So there's lots of really important strategies that we need to put in place, but often leaders are on that journey too. And it's at that stage of things that a lot of these very intentional actions don't tend to happen.
Great. And so as we start to wrap up today, and I'm hearing kind of there's these intentional actions, et cetera, I'm assuming that is definitely built into what you're doing at Hummingly.
Yeah, absolutely. So we talk about a triple responsibility to doing pressure well. So this is about setting your people up and your organization up to grow and perform under pressure and avoid all the negative things of a hazard of prolonged pressure, like burnout, and all of those other pieces like decision making that can be impacted. And so with the triple responsibility piece, like we equip leaders with, workshops around what do you need to do to be able to lead your people under pressure, and to do that well, and to set them up to grow and avoid some of the damage, and to sustain leaders too, because they're susceptible to burnout. They've been carrying a lot. And then there's workshops that looks at the individual piece and the team component together. So team workshops where everybody's creating a very intentional plan to support their well-being when the pressure's on, with pressure tested strategies. And they're working as a team, knowing how to support each other when the pressure's on.
Right. And so what's the key takeaway that you have for small business owners and executives listening in today?
Yeah, and I can probably tell a story to illustrate this. One of the things we tend to see is when you're under pressure, especially if you're a small business owner, right, it often feels relentless. And we often approach a pressured situation, our stress hormones drive us this way, where when we face a challenge, we become very task oriented, and we often shelve some of the things that we know are really important, like our health basics, the things we do to nurture our relationships, the things that we do in our life that give our life joy and color, right? A lot of those things we shelve for a short period of time to focus on a challenge. And that works, we're set up for that. But when you shelve those things for a prolonged period, which is often what, the world will throw at us, then that will have some very real impacts, really sobering impacts on people's health, mental health, and relationships. So I'd say really focus on the things that are important in your life, that if you lost or damaged them in some way, that would really impact your quality of life, maybe your health, your relationships, whatever it is. Keep that at, as your compass, and make sure they are reflected on your to-do list and in your calendar, because otherwise they will drop off. And the same goes for your self-care practices, because just a really quick story. One of the people, and we looked at global research. We had Winston Churchill fellowships to research this globally. And one of the people we spoke to was a leader in Australia who, phenomenal leader, really amazing reputation, achieved incredible things. And we were really, crushing on being able to interview her. And in doing so, she said, look, I'm sorry, I'm not at work at the minute. I'm actually home on stress leave. But I think it's really important that we do this interview anyway. And when we talked about the very real impacts of burnout for her and what had happened, it was sad, right? In terms of her career, her health, her mental health, her relationships. But the thing that really got me was when she said, that's not the scary piece. She said, the scary piece was when I stopped because I had to, my body said no more. But I turned around and I looked at my team, and I realized they were just 2 or 3 weeks behind me in terms of their journey to burnout. And so I would say, business leaders in any form, sometimes it's really hard to prioritize ourselves when you're trying to buffer your team from stress. You've got a whole lot of challenges at play. But if you can't do it for yourself, because it often feels uncomfortable and impossible, hopefully we can get to the point that we do it because we are important. But if you're not there yet, then do it for your team, because a question that's really important is, where am I at? Because that's where I'm leading others to, right? To a place of calm or chaos or burnout.
Yeah, absolutely. Because we're setting the tone for what that is specifically for our team. So, real quickly, as we kind of wrap up today, is what's one key takeaway for HR professionals listening in?
I think the key takeaway is that prolonged pressure is hazardous, and it's hazardous and risky, not just for the people in your organization, but also for your organization. In terms of what it is you're trying to achieve, in terms of the types of decisions that will be made, in terms of turnover, all of those things. So massive risk for people and massive risk for your organization. So if we can address that like we would any other hazard. We would put training in place. We would try to address the hazard at the source wherever we could. We would have PPE, and just to know that you can really tip the balance from damage to growth with very intentional actions. It's not as hard as it sounds.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think some of that is doing some project-based work, because where's the beginning? Where's the end? We know it's the end. Now we can take a breath before we start the next thing, and having that clear communication strategy.
Absolutely.
Great. Well, Jolie, we will have all of your information in our show notes today. So if individuals want to follow up with you, they absolutely can. And I just want to thank you for being on our show today.
Thanks, Tracy. Thanks very much for having me.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Talent Optimization Podcast. You'll find more tools and resources for CEOs and HR professionals looking to bridge the strategies versus implementation gap of talent optimization at elevatedtalentconsulting.com. We've also created a free, valuable resource for you to begin bridging the gap called the Talent Optimization Foundation Membership Program. You can access it for free at elevatedtalentconsulting.com/foundation. Be sure to tune in next week for another episode to learn more about talent optimization and creating a dream team for your organization.